My name, Michael. I was 30 years old, and for most of my life, I had believed that family meant safety. But I was wrong. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other and where family secrets never stayed hidden for too long. My father was a strict man, and my mother always stood by him no matter what decision he made. I had a younger brother named Daniel, who was treated like a golden child, while I was expected to sacrifice quietly. From the beginning, I felt like I was standing outside of my own family. When Daniel failed at something, my father would laugh it off. But if I made a single mistake, the house would shake with his anger. I kept telling myself that maybe I was too sensitive, maybe I was exaggerating. But deep down, I knew the truth. I was never the son my father wanted me to be. Life moved on slowly. I finished school. I found a small job. I tried to build a future. Still, I never left the house because my father insisted that a son should remain close to his family. Sometimes I dreamed of leaving everything behind and starting fresh, but my mother would stop me with her soft voice saying, "Michael, family is family, no matter what." What? Those words tied me down like invisible chains. It was not until I turned 30 that I began to see the cracks clearly. One evening, while I was searching for an old file in the study, I found a folder that did not belong there. Inside were documents written in my father's handwriting. They were contracts and property papers, and I froze when I realized what they meant. The house I thought belonged to our family was already sold secretly months ago. My father had signed it away without telling us. At first, I told myself it could not be true. I must have misunderstood. But the signatures were there, his name was clear, and the date showed that he had planned this long before. He had not even discussed it with my mother. I remember standing in that silent study feeling as if the ground beneath me had disappeared. That night, I could not sleep. My father sat in the living room watching television with Daniel beside him. I wanted to storm in and shout at him, but something held me back. I stared at the flickering light from the TV, and I asked myself what would happen if I exposed the truth. Would my mother break apart? Would Daniel blame me? Would my father deny everything I felt like a prisoner, holding the key, but afraid to use it? Days passed, and the secret grew heavier. Every time my father looked at me, I felt like he knew I had discovered something. Every time my mother served dinner with her usual smile, I wondered if she had any idea that the house she loved so much was no longer ours. My chest carried a weight I could not describe. Then, one afternoon, while walking back from work, I overheard two men talking near the shop. They mentioned my father's name, and one of them laughed, saying that he was clever to sell the property before anyone found out. My stomach twisted. It was true. He had made a deal behind closed doors. He had taken away the very ground we lived on, and none of us knew. I returned home with fire in my chest. I wanted to confront him that instant. But when I entered the house, my mother was humming in the kitchen, and Daniel was lying on the sofa reading his phone. They looked so normal, so peaceful. I could not break their world with the storm inside me. I swallowed my anger, and I locked myself in my room. That night, I wrote in my diary. I had not used it for years, but now every word felt like survival. I wrote about my father, about the secret papers, about the betrayal. I asked myself questions with no answers. Why would he do this? Was money more important than his family? Did he ever care about us at all? Days turned into weeks. The tension in the house grew heavier, though no one spoke about it. My father continued with his stern silence. My mother continued with her calm voice, and Daniel lived in his own world. Only I carried the truth like a burning coal in my pocket. Finally, one night, everything changed. My father called me into the living room. His eyes were cold, sharper than usual. He said, "Michael, I know what you found." My heart stopped. He knew. I wanted to deny it, but my throat was dry. He leaned forward and said, "If you tell anyone, you will destroy this family. Do you understand?" I stared at him, and in that moment, I realized the cruelest truth. He had never cared about the family. He cared only about control. He sold the house because he wanted freedom for himself, maybe money for himself. And now, he wanted me to carry the burden of silence. I walked out without answering. My mother asked what happened, but I shook my head. Daniel laughed from the corner as if nothing mattered. I went back to my room and sat there until morning. The decision was heavy before me. I could stay silent and keep the family together, or I could speak out and risk breaking everything apart. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. The night after my father warned me to stay silent, I could not close my eyes. I sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker like weak candles outside the glass. Every sound of passing cars felt distant. Every tick of the clock reminded me that time was moving. But my life was stuck in one lament of betrayal. I kept replaying his words. "If you tell anyone, you will destroy this family," his voice still echoed in my chest. I wanted to scream that he was the one destroying the family. Not me. I wanted to ask why he thought money was worth more than trust. But the walls around me held my voice like a prison. The next morning, my mother placed a plate of breakfast before me, as if nothing had changed. Her hands were gentle, but I could see the shadows under her eyes. She looked at me for a long second, then turned away. I wondered if she knew more than she admitted. Maybe she had accepted his decisions long ago. Maybe silence had become her shield. Daniel was cheerful as always. Laughing at some video on his phone, he did not notice the storm between us. He had always been the golden child, untouched by the weight of our father's rules, and untouched by the truths that lay hidden. He had no idea that the very roof above us no longer belonged to us. I walked to work that day, but every step felt heavy. I could hear the whispers of the town people greeted me politely, but I felt like they knew everything already. It was a small town after all. Secrets here were like smoke. You could never hold them for long, sooner or later. They spread through every street. At work, I could not focus. I shuffled papers. I answered calls. But my thoughts always returned to that folder. The signature, the date, the cruel reality that our home was gone. My chest tightened. Whenever I imagined the day we would be forced to leave, the day my mother would stand helpless at the door with tears in her eyes. By the time I returned home, the sun had set. The air was cool and still. The living room light spilled onto the porch where my father sat with a cigarette. His eyes followed me as I entered, but neither of us spoke. His silence was not ordinary. It was sharp. It was like a knife that cut me without touching me. That night, I opened my diary again. I wrote that I could no longer bear this weight alone. I needed to choose a path. Silence or truth. Both carried pain, but only one. Carried dignity. I told myself that if I stayed silent, I would become like him. A man who hid in shadows. A man who sold trust for coins. And if I spoke the truth, I risked breaking my mother and losing Daniel forever. Days passed with the same cold rhythm, my father avoiding me, my mother pretending nothing was wrong. Daniel lost in his own easy world, but inside me, the fire grew. I started noticing small details I had never seen before, like the way my father counted money in his room late at night, the way he avoided certain phone calls when we were around, the way his eyes darted to the door whenever someone knocked too loud. One evening while my father was away, I searched his study again, my hands shaking. I knew it was dangerous, but I could not stop myself. I pulled open drawers, I lifted files, and beneath a stack of old receipts, I found another envelope inside. Were letters from the buyer. Letters that proved he had not just sold the house, he had been planning to sell. More land in my mother's name, without telling her. My breath froze in my chest. I clutched the papers like they were burning my skin. He was not stopping at one betrayal. He was preparing for another. I understood now that silence would not protect this family. Silence would bury it. I folded the letters and hid them inside my diary. I knew I had to talk to my mother, but I did not want to break her heart. She had always believed that loyalty to a husband was the duty of a wife. What would happen if I showed her that loyalty had been repaid with betrayal? That night I sat beside her in the kitchen. She was stirring tea slowly, as if each circle of the spoon carried her whole life. I wanted to open my mouth, but the words refused to come. She looked at me and smiled weakly. "Michael, you look tired," she said. I nodded and kept my secret locked away once more. The following week, rumors began spreading in town. Whispers that my father was meeting with men late at night. Whispers that money was passing hands. I pretended not to hear them, but deep inside, I knew they were true. The world outside was learning what I had kept inside, and soon the storm would arrive at our doorstep. Saturday afternoon, Daniel burst into my room, his face red with anger. He waved his phone at me and shouted, "What did you do, Michael?" I was confused until he showed me a message. Thread someone had sent him proof about the property sale. Someone had told him that his father had betrayed us. But Daniel believed it was me who exposed it. He screamed that I was jealous, that I always wanted to ruin the family, that I could never accept him as the favorite. I stood there frozen, the truth on my lips, but no voice in my throat. He stormed out, slamming the door, and the sound echoed like thunder in my skull. Later that evening, my father confronted me, his eyes blazing. He said, "I warned you, Michael. Now look what you have done. The family will never forgive you." I tried to protest. I tried to say that it was his actions, not mine. But he silenced me with his stare. He always had a way of making me feel small, like a child. Even when I was a grown man, but that night I made a decision. No matter how much fear I carried, no matter how much blame was thrown on me, I would not remain silent. I would protect my mother, and I would face my brother with the truth. I would show them the letters, the contracts, the betrayal hidden in my father's study. I waited until midnight. When the house was quiet, I pulled out the envelope and placed it on my desk. I stared at it for hours, knowing that tomorrow everything would change. I imagined the storm, the arguments, the tears. But I also imagined a future where I could breathe without chains, where I could look at myself in the mirror without shame. When the sun rose the next morning, I walked into the kitchen with the letters in my hand. My mother was there, her eyes tired. Daniel was at the table avoiding me. My father had not yet come downstairs. I placed the papers on the table, my voice steady. Though my hands trembled, "It is time to know the truth," I said, and as the silence filled the room, I felt that the choice I had avoided for so long was finally upon me. The decision was heavy before me. I could stay silent and keep the family together, or I could speak out and risk breaking everything apart. Either way, nothing would ever be the same again. I remember staring at the ceiling that night, my thoughts running in circles. The house around me was quiet, but inside my chest there was only noise, questions that had no answers. My father's words echoed again and again. "If you tell anyone, you will destroy this family." But wasn't he the one destroying it already? For days after that conversation, I moved like a ghost in my own home. I went to work, came back, shared dinner with my mother and Daniel. But inside me, there was a storm no one could see. My father barely looked at me. Sometimes I caught his eyes across the table, sharp and cold, reminding me that he knew what I carried inside. One evening, as my mother poured soup into my bowl, I studied her face. She looked tired, but peaceful, humming softly to herself. She loved this house. Every corner held her memories, her wedding day, raising us as children, birthdays, winters by the fire. And now I knew the cruel truth. All of it was already gone. My father had sold it months ago. I wanted to tell her. The words rose to my throat many times, but they always died before I could speak. I could not bring myself to shatter her world. I could not steal the last piece of peace she had. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed to live in another universe. He laughed at his phone, hung out with friends, and hardly noticed anything around him. Once, when we were alone, I asked, "Do you ever feel like Dad hides things from us?" Daniel barely looked up. "Dad knows what he's doing. He's smart. You worry too much, Michael." Then he returned to his screen, as if my question had never mattered. That answer cut me more than I expected. Daniel trusted our father blindly, just as he always had. To him, Dad was a figure of strength, a man who could never be wrong. And me? I was only the brother who doubted, who carried shadows. The pressure grew unbearable. I began writing more in my diary, pouring out thoughts I could never say aloud. Sometimes I filled entire pages in a single night, my hand cramping but my mind refusing to stop. Those pages became the only place I could breathe. But secrets do not stay buried forever. One Saturday afternoon, as I sat in the kitchen pretending to read a newspaper, I heard voices in the living room. My father was on the phone. His tone was sharp, impatient. "Yes, I told you already, the house is gone. The deal is done. Don't call me again unless you have the money ready." My chest froze. His words were louder than thunder. My mother, who had just entered the room with a basket of laundry, stopped in her tracks. She stood there, her face pale, listening. The call ended, and my father turned to see her. Their eyes met, and I knew this was the moment everything would break. "What deal?" my mother asked quietly, her voice trembling. My father's jaw tightened. "It's nothing. Don't ask questions you don't understand." But my mother wasn't fooled. She set the basket down, her hands shaking. "Tell me the truth. What have you done?" I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. I should have spoken, should have stepped in, but fear pinned me to my chair. I wanted to scream. He sold the house. He betrayed us permission, but my throat was locked. Instead, I watched as silence stretched between them. My father finally said, cold as stone, "This is my house, my decision. I don't need your permission." My mother's face crumpled. She sat down slowly, as if the strength had left her body. I couldn't take it anymore. The words burst out before I could stop myself. "He sold the house, Mom, months ago. I found the papers." The room went silent. My father's eyes turned on me, filled with fury. My mother stared at me, then at him, her lips trembling. "Is it true?" she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother cry, not the quiet tears of sadness, but deep, broken sobs that shook her entire body. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling. Something shattered inside me. All those years of holding my silence, all those nights of carrying his secrets I had kept quiet to protect her. But in the end, the truth had destroyed her anyway. My father stood there, unmoved, his face hard. He didn't comfort her. He didn't apologize. He only turned and walked away, leaving us in the ruins of his choices. That night, the house was silent in a way I had never felt before. Daniel didn't speak to me. He barely looked at me, anger flashing in his eyes. "Why did you say anything?" he whispered harshly when we passed each other in the hallway. "You've ruined everything. Ruined everything." The words cut deep. But hadn't our father ruined everything first? In the weeks that followed, the house became a battlefield of silence. My mother stopped talking to my father, except when necessary. Daniel avoided me as if I were poison. And my father, he carried himself as though nothing had changed, as though we were all just too emotional to understand him. I began to realize that the family I had tried so hard to protect had never truly been whole. It had only been a fragile illusion, held together by silence and fear. Now that the truth was out, the cracks had become impossible to ignore. One night, unable to bear it any longer, I left the house and walked through the quiet streets of our town. The air was cold, the streetlights casting long shadows. I thought about my life, 30 years of silence, 30 years of trying to be the son he wanted, 30 years of sacrificing myself for a family that never saw me. And for the first time, I asked myself a dangerous question. What if I walked away? What if I left the house, the family, the pain, everything? What if I finally chose myself instead of them? The thought terrified me, but it also lit something inside me, a spark of freedom I had never felt before. When I returned home that night, the house looked different. It wasn't a home anymore. It was just walls and memories, some of them beautiful, many of them painful. I went to my room, opened my diary, and wrote a single line. Maybe it's time to leave. But leaving would not be so simple. Because family, no matter how broken, leaves chains around your heart. And I knew that if I chose to walk away, my life and theirs would never be the same again. I left the living room that night with my father's words still echoing in my ears. Silence felt like a chain around my neck, but breaking it felt like jumping into fire. Every step I took back to my room was heavy. My mother's eyes had followed me with quiet worry. Daniel had barely looked up from his phone, and my father had leaned back in his chair like a king who had given his final command. I shut the door behind me and pressed my back against it. The air in my room felt thick. I opened my diary again, the pages now carrying more of my soul than I had ever shared with another human being. I wrote about fear, anger, betrayal. I wrote until my hand ached. The next morning, sunlight came through the window, but it did not feel warm. It felt like judgment. My mother knocked on my door and asked if I wanted breakfast. Her voice trembled slightly. I wondered if she had heard something last night. I joined her at the table. Daniel was not there, and my father had already left. My mother tried to smile while pouring tea, but her hands shook. For the first time, I thought maybe she already knew something. Maybe she was living in denial, because truth would destroy her. As days passed, I noticed small details I had ignored before. Whispers between my parents that stopped when I entered the room. Daniel making careless jokes about money. My father avoiding eye contact with me. It felt as if the house itself was shrinking, walls pressing closer, the air thinner every day. My diary grew thicker. Every night I wrote about the war inside me. Silence versus truth. One evening, Daniel came into my room without knocking. He dropped onto my chair and smirked. He said I looked tired, like I was carrying something too heavy. I froze. For a second, I thought maybe he knew. But then he laughed, saying I always took life too seriously, that I should be more like him. I clenched my fists under the desk. If only he knew that his comfort existed, because I carried the storm alone. Later that week, I returned home earlier than usual from work. The house was strangely quiet. I heard voices in the study. I crept closer and heard my father speaking to someone on the phone. His tone was sharp, urgent. He was talking about payment, about keeping things hidden, about not letting the family find out. My chest pounded. I wanted to push the door open and confront him, but I forced myself to step back. Instead, I wrote down every word I remembered in my diary. Evidence, at least for myself. My nights grew darker. Dreams haunted me, dreams where the house crumbled and my family pointed at me as the reason. I woke up drenched in sweat. I wondered if silence was already destroying me more than truth ever could. Then, one Saturday afternoon, the storm broke. A letter arrived by mail, addressed to my father. He was not home, so I picked it up. Curiosity burned through me. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside was an official notice confirming the final transfer of property ownership. Our home, the place where my mother planted flowers and Daniel celebrated birthdays, legally belonged to another man now. My stomach turned. It was no longer a secret contract. It was done. Final. I knew I could not keep it inside anymore. I walked to the kitchen where my mother was preparing tea. I placed the letter on the table. She looked at it, then at me. Her hands shook as she opened it. Her lips parted in disbelief. She whispered my father's name like a broken prayer. Tears filled her eyes. She sat down heavily, her whole body trembling. In that moment, I realized she had never known. She had trusted him completely, and now that trust shattered before her eyes. I held her hand as she wept. For the first time in years, she looked at me not as the weaker son, not as the one who always disappointed, but as the only one standing beside her in truth. Her tears soaked my shirt as I hugged her. She asked me what we would do now. My throat burned, but I told her we would face it together. That night when my father returned, the house did not feel the same. My mother sat in the living room with the letter on the table. Daniel hovered near the doorway, confused. I stood by my mother's side. My father's eyes fell on the paper, and then on me. For the first time, fear flickered across his face. He tried to speak, but my mother raised her voice. She asked him if everything was true. He tried to deny it, but the letter was undeniable. The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Daniel looked from one face to another, his smirk gone, replaced by shock. He asked if this was a joke. My father shouted at him to be quiet, but the power in his voice had weakened. The king's throne was crumbling. My mother stood up, tears in her eyes but strength in her voice. She said he had betrayed not just her, but the entire family. The argument that followed shook the house. My father tried to justify himself, saying he needed money, saying he had no choice, saying family would not understand. But every word sounded hollow. Daniel shouted that I must have planned this, that I was happy to see the family broken. I wanted to hit him, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told him the truth was in front of his eyes, and no one could twist it anymore. The night ended with silence again, but this silence was different. It was the silence of broken glass. My mother sat in her room alone. Daniel locked himself away, probably still refusing to believe. My father stayed downstairs, the man who had ruled this house now just a shadow. And I sat by my window, diary open, pen in hand, heart heavy, but strangely lighter than before. Because for the first time I had chosen truth. I wrote that night until dawn. Every line felt like a step forward, away from chains that had bound me for 30 years. The house was no longer ours, the family no longer whole, but I had found my voice. I promised myself I would never let silence bury me again. Like and subscribe.